welcome back to our Club Hype community podcast, where we give our personal insights, different topics regarding podcasts. Yeah, today.
And we talk about why we love audio so much, right? Or, why it's worth falling in love with audio and, why audio is just the greatest medium of all time.
Yeah, right. Yeah. And of course, the latest news all around the podcasting and audio universe. Hosting this podcast with me is Max. Hello.
Hello, Jan.
Hello. And today we are kind of analyzing one of your favorite podcasts and formats, I think. Yeah. What podcast did you bring with you today?
Yeah, like maybe for a bit of background, why do we analyze it? Because we thought, we're just not in love with podcasts, but we also want to, give you feedback and why it's, worth falling in love with podcasts and, give you a bit of insights into like great podcasts and why they work or why we think, they work and what is great. And, maybe you can learn stuff from it. And if you already have a podcast, you can learn from it. Or if you think about starting a podcast, you can take some learnings from that. And I think one of the greatest podcasts that I've listened to, and I don't remember how I learned about that podcast, and I've been listening to it for quite some time now, is Revisionist History by Malcolm Gladwell. It's really an amazing podcast. And yeah, do you want me to tell you a bit about the podcast?
Yeah, just maybe a short summary.
Yeah, so it's for them, it's always about like the overlooked or misunderstood. That's how they say it. So they kind of like re-examine stuff from the past. So it could be an event, it could be a story, it could be a song, an idea, or something that came up, and they just revisiting that moment in time to see if we're still right about this, or if something changed, or if we should have a different view on it and we get a different outcome. So I would say it's a bit nerdy the way it's set up, but it's also like very cool in exploring stuff that you don't necessarily think about like on a day-to-day basis as we do about the Roman Empire, apparently,
Oh yeah.
So and that's why I love the podcast so much.
Yeah, same with me. I only had listened to the first 3 or 4 episodes in preparation for this podcast, and I kind of fell in love with it because it's I think I can depend on the information that's spread in there, which comes more difficult these times because it's very well produced, and I really like the topics, and I really like the general idea of the podcast, getting different perspectives on history and maybe changing history. Just in general, a great idea, and the few episodes that I've listened to were very well produced. I really liked how emotional they got from time to time, but still, depending on facts, a lot of experts in there, and I think that's a great mixture.
Yeah, I think so. They get it really well. They get it right on the aspect of doing a scientific kind of project, but turning it into like a pop cultural phenomenon, right? So they bring that combination of a dry topic and make it emotional and kind of like loading it with that emotion, that personal touch, and it's kind of like popular science. So his books work the same way. And what I think is really interesting, what you said. So I agree on the points that you make, and I would love to add one thing: the way they think about stuff is, and listening to like the thought patterns and that kind of stuff helps me personally also to approach things differently. So, trying to challenge stuff in a positive way, or in my business context, like, going back to things that, maybe half a year ago or a year ago, I thought, they were right. It's always worth going back to see like, hey, what has changed? What have we learned with that knowledge that we have now? Does it change anything? And I think that is a thing that is really helpful in approaching.
We've talked a lot about the meta of the podcast. Would you like to just exemplary maybe dive into one episode, give some summary of that. I personally, I love the McDonald's one.
Yeah, so it's basically talking about that McDonald's changed the fries, right? So in the past they were frying their French fries in beef tallow. Now they changed to vegetable oil. And, you know, by doing that, it's kind of like it was peer pressure, getting rid of like unhealthy choices, but it kind of like made a great product less great. So and you know they make this like small thing into like a big, you know, topic, and then what's underlying for like, you know, things that maybe, you know, are good or bad in the way we do stuff as a business or something like that, right? And what I find interesting, and you mentioned that just in a by sentence, is like you see that as a source of truth. And you just said you only heard like the first few episodes, and before I told you about the podcast, you weren't 100% aware of Malcolm Gladwell as this like figure. So that's interesting that you mentioned that, because what is interesting that you like instantly see this as a source of truth, right? By the way they created it, and by the way they kind of like explain where they get the data, and by the people they invite. So they're quite transparent on that as well. So it's interesting how, you know, quickly they gained your trust, right, with that format. So that is quite interesting to see. But yeah, that is one episode. One is about like those accidents that happen with like this issue of where people feel
Toyota,
like,
I think.
yeah, Toyota, they had this, you know, recall of like cars that malfunction, and then in the end, it, you know, it wasn't the car, it was like it was a human error, or they do something on self-driving cars, or, you know, for the last seasons, especially the latest season now, it's all on the same topic. So they do 6 episodes on gun control, like a 6-part series on gun control, and they're very unbiased regarding that topic, and they say like, hey, this is our stand on it. But, you know, they not only just go ahead and say like, hey, we're pro guns, or we're completely against it, but they really having a look at, you know, what is the scenario and why, and finding also new arguments why it's bad to have guns, or, you know, why it's, you know, on some occasions it's okay to have, you know, guns or whatever. So they're very, you know, unbiased in that. So yeah, it's a scientific approach to, you know, the issues that they look at.
Yeah, it's very factual. Yeah, which may lead us to the segment 2 of our episode, which is where we talk about how do they achieve that. And for me, it was like the whole structure of the episode, which made it very credible, because it's not only him telling his story, like he's a journalist and he's very good at that. It's also like different interviews of experts, and it's not like just a hard cut and they're cutting to the experts. There's always a story behind it, which makes them way more credible. And I think which makes the whole interview a bit more emotional. For example, there was this episode where they were checking the grammar of the American Constitution, and he was segueing to, or he was transitioning to the interview and telling the listeners about this lady where he worked at the New York Times, and there was this grumpy lady, and she was always checking and editing his texts. And we kind of had like a picture of her, and then they transitioned to the interview of her and checking the grammar, and it was way more emotional that way than just saying, yeah, there's an expert on grammar and she said that and that. So it's always a story, and he takes the listener with him, and it's very emotional. I think it's a great contrast between emotion and facts.
Yeah, I think, yeah, it's that storytelling element of it. So they do a storytelling. So they give this whole thing a context. So you're not starting like in an interview or in a different kind of like setting. So they kind of set the scene. So setting the scene in a storytelling format, I think is crucial, and that's what they do really well. And they do that with kind of like a personal story or something like that guides you through the whole episode. And then, you know, to then make your point, you don't have to make the point yourself. you go ahead and do all these interviews. But that's great journalistic work. So you kind of gather, so you have a topic, then you do all those interviews, and then from there you go ahead and start writing your storyline. With the development of that storyline, there's maybe stuff that you feel like, hey, I'm missing parts here, so I need to go back and do more interviews. So I think what they do is kind of like they have a topic, they start on that, they do the first interviews, they get kind of like a feeling for it, kind of like a story emerges. From that, they continue to build on it, and then by the end, they start kind of like putting it together to what they want to do it. And that's a great way to do it. This, of course, requires a lot of work on the one hand, to turn it into like a 6, 8 or whatever part series. Even if you do individual episodes, that even takes, up a lot of work. You probably, if you want to do like a 1 episode thing, a lot more than if you do like a 5 or 6 part series, because you can do like a 5 or 6 part series and you can tell like a longer story. So like doing an episode, like a single episode, what they did at the beginning with a certain topic, I think that's even more challenging because you're trying to condense it into like 40 minutes. But what we see now, and this is something I think that a lot of people now taking from like an example of revisionist history that are doing it really well, is the storytelling formats that we're seeing now all over the place, like also in Germany popping up, from Cui Bono or OMR doing the rabbit hole thing on the Samba brothers. So there's great stuff in there. And also, the big investigative pieces that are now being done, like investigative journalism. You see that a lot, that now those investigative pieces on Wirecard and other stuff is all now done in like 6 to 8 part kind of like podcast stories, because you can tell, an emotional stories, you can have the direct quotes, you can have the interviews. So you make it really interesting, really sticky, and you don't have, you can tell a much longer story for like 6 hours, 7 hours than just condensing it into like a 3-page article, that comes out in a newspaper. You can still do that, but overall it's great to have that. And I think that's why storytelling in podcasting goes really well together. And it's a thing that we should see a lot more in the future, not just in the, in the publishing space, but also if you think about corporates as well. Think about that 6-part series from a cybersecurity company on like true crime in the cyberspace or something like that, right? There's a lot of stuff that you can do in that space as well. So I think that's what they're really good at in bringing that, narrative in combination with those background talks together, and turning it into like a coherent story is really well framed. And that's good journalism work in the end. And if you want to do that as an amateur, you should definitely get some help from somebody who knows how to do that. But that's just the content side of it, the creation side. But let's focus on the production as well, right? What that's your thing. So what do you think about the production?
First of all, the segments where he's obviously in the studio they sound perfect. I think he's got a nice voice. But what was very special to me was that I think they take the listeners with them everywhere. So they always got their gear with them. It's like solving a case, solving a riddle, and being by their side. And what I really liked, for example, was when they tasted the fries. They tried to recreate those fries, and the quality wasn't insane. It was like a very reverberant room, but it was very emotional. And I think then the quality isn't that important anymore, because I really liked how you could feel you could hear how he tasted those fries, and it was kind of
like ASMR, numbing. Right?
It was ASMR, yeah, basically. And he was laughing like a little child. And I really loved that. It was more like, how's it called? At the end of the movie, there are like scenes where you get to see
like outtakes,
outtakes, yeah, sort of like outtakes. I loved that. Production quality isn't insane on those outtakes, but It really works for me because it delivers emotion, and
yeah, it's real, right? It's real.
It's
It's
very
that real
real.
feeling of it.
It's very credible.
And isn't that crazy when you describe that? Like you can, and by tying that together, where you have like high quality studio production, combine it with medium quality on the go production, for that right kind of like moment, and tying that together, it's completely fine, and it's acceptable for the audience. And I think for that type of production, bringing your and that's easy nowadays. Bringing for a production, bringing like audio equipment, like very basic audio equipment with you is, you don't need like a big team to do that. So you can easily do that. And isn't that crazy that by doing that, it creates so much emotion for you and those images in your head without using video, where food, everybody says like, if you do something on food, it should be visual. And visual is great, but you can do a lot of great stuff on food and drinks that is non-visual, because you kind of like combine that emotion, that still describing aspect of it, with kind of like the ASMR aspect, and then with your own imagination, because you don't know where they set. So it kind of like sparks imagination because you don't see it exactly as it is. So it kind of like even sparks a bit more of imagination. So it's a very different feeling that you create, because, and that can sometimes be much more emotional than seeing the actual place, because you kind of like imagine probably a different place where they're at, that you kind of like zoom in on, that I do, and it's still, but we still get the same emotion from it. We still get the same audio from them. So I think that is a great value to show in audio as well. And yeah, but of course with those type of productions, that takes a lot of work, cutting in the end, taking the time. So the recording of the interview and everything, that is easy, but then later on bringing those little pieces of audio into a flow, having a bit of music and everything. So, the post-production, everything that takes up quite some time. But, if you think in seasons, and that is the thing that I want to stress now, if you do think in seasons, it's a specific time frame, right? And if we think about a corporate space and you think about doing that, it's a very specific time frame, maybe let's say 6 weeks or 8 weeks where you work on that, for example, or it could be longer, it doesn't matter. But sometimes for those big productions, it's a year of work where they do research and everything. But like think about a smaller thing where you maybe like 12 weeks, you put 12 weeks in to get that done, and the hours that you put in for that time, doing the research, doing the post-production and everything. A lot of companies think like it's so much easier if I do like a weekly interview, but then think about, getting the guest on board, briefing the guest, all that kind of stuff, then doing a weekly production, doing the weekly post-production. It seems a lot easier, but if you think about doing that for 40 weeks or 50 weeks a year, the hours that you put in, you kind of probably end up at a very similar level than doing like a high-end production for like 12, 16 weeks, and then tie that into your marketing campaign that you have going anyway. Do one big promotion around that season instead of continuously promoting your episodes that are coming out on a weekly or bi-weekly basis. So in the end, where it initially feels like, oh, there's going to be so much work in those 8 episodes that are going to put in, but in the end, maybe the outcome is the same from a work standpoint, from a resource standpoint, and you might even be more focused when it comes to campaigning and advertising it than doing it for like a 40-week running, seasonal or episodic kind of like show. So that is something that is a takeaway that I always see in comparison from like doing seasons or doing like a weekly thing. So my takeaways from this, and this is maybe what you can learn from this podcast that you can take away for you. They kind of do a niche podcast, right, on a very specific topic, but it's also what he does. So they find, like the host found a topic that he works well with. So that's something you should do. And then you can really work great in your niche for a specific audience with the specific topic that you want to do. Yeah, that is one thing. The second thing is, as we mentioned before, consider working in seasons or on a weekly basis. In the end, you might end up at the same kind of like resources that you need to put in, the same kind of hours that you need to put in. So it could be an interesting way of doing that. And it also differentiates yourself from a lot of other stuff that is out there. And thirdly, I think, if you want to do something like that, you need, if you're not a journalist or don't have any journalistic background or something like that, you definitely need somebody to work with in scripting it and finding the right approach. Those are kind of like my 3 takeaways from this, and what you should consider if you think about, hey, maybe what can I learn from revisionist history, or can I read do something like that in a similar fashion.
Yeah, thank you, Max. I think that put a perfect ending to our little podcast. I definitely recommend listening to the Revisionist History, and I hope we see or we hear us next week.
Yes.